All right. So, welcome, whether you're live, we've got a pack of people live here, and or if you're watching this after the fact, either way. This is the September 15th meeting for St. Michael's. St. Michael's is a parish of the Apostolic Johannite Church in Chicago, Illinois, in the United States. I am Mark Thomas. I'm the rector of St. Michael's and also the primate for the United States. So we're going to be talking a little bit about Sophia today. And obviously, this is a figure that looms large in Gnostic cosmology. But I want to take a somewhat broader look and then focus in sort of gradually. As I've said, as I've mentioned earlier on before I started the recording, my goal is to just make some introductory comments. And then if folks have questions or want to continue the conversation, certainly welcome to do so. But I will go ahead and once we've dealt with the questions, I'll go ahead and turn the recording off so you guys can discuss at will. So the reason that we're talking about Sophia today actually is because this meeting was originally scheduled for last Friday, which would have been the feast of the descent of the Holy Sophia on the AJC calendar. So that's why we're sort of picking up this theme. Unfortunately, because of some scheduling issues, we had to push it back a week. But this really does seem to be sort of the season for Sophia on our calendar. There are a couple of Sophianic feasts that are in this sort of period of the year. So Sophia, of course, is the Greek word that's usually, or almost always, translated into English as wisdom. In my non-ecclesiastical life, I'm a professor of philosophy, so we talk about Sophia a lot. Philosophy is the love of wisdom or friendship for wisdom. She's almost always personified as feminine, but she's not a goddess in the traditional sense of the word for the Greeks. But rather, there is a tendency among the Greeks and later among Romans as well to create female allegorical personifications of various virtues. And certainly that's going to include the sort of intellectual virtues. Originally, wisdom, Sophia, seems to have a meaning that's much closer to phronesis, that is, say, prudence, doing the right thing at the right time in the right way, or even of skill, techne. Now, these are among the other intellectual virtues that are mentioned by Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics. But eventually, and by eventually I mean by the time of Aristotle, Sophia has come to mean that wisdom in which the highest good is beheld. Right? Now, that phrase actually comes from Augustine, and he's keen on identifying the sort of eternity of wisdom, of divine wisdom, as this way in which we can have a glimpse of and know the good. But I think that it applies perfectly well for Aristotle as well, that wisdom is the intellectual virtue that we acquire so that we can have this vision of the good, of what the Neoplatonists are ultimately going to call the one, or so on and so forth. But we also see wisdom taking a very important role in the Jewish tradition. So in the book of Proverbs, we see a number of descriptions of or characterizations of wisdom wisdom is dwelling in a certain place. She is speaking, and the word that is translated as wisdom, the sort of equivalent for Sophia in Hebrew, is of course Chokhmah, hence the Gnostic Achmoth, which seems to be just simply a corruption or a rendering of Chokhmah. Again, we see this feminine personification, and there is something ideally almost feminine about wisdom and about the possibility of gaining wisdom. And in part, I think that this has to do with a certain degree of gender politics, in which wisdom is something that one pursues. Wisdom is something that one obtains. And those kinds of ideas are frequently gendered feminine in both Greek and in Hebrew. So it makes a certain amount of sense. Kabbalistically, Chokhmah is the second sphere. And traditionally, she has two aspects or two faces that she's very much doubled. And I found this very, very striking because when we start to look at some of the Gnostic sort of conceptions of Sophia, we also see this doubling. Of course, in many forms of classical Gnosticism, the idea of a twin, a syzygy, or a doubling is vitally important. So she is, or it is, Chokhmah is the first point of creation. And so we're not even close to the material world in the Kabbalistic cosmology. And yet we've moved out of the realm of the void or the emptiness that is Kether. I don't want to use void in a negative sense here, but the crown is a kind of vastness. And so when we move into that second sphere of Chokhmah, all of a sudden we're concretizing in a very, very specific way. This ultimately plays out in the Christian tradition as well. Although the particulars of the Christian tradition I've always found fascinating, because the term Hagia Sophia, the holy wisdom, originally applies to Christ as the Logos, as the initial thought of the Father. And it's only later on that it begins to be associated with feminine figures. Ultimately, it will be associated with the Theotokos, with the Blessed Virgin, and in a more mystical sense, with the third person of the Trinity. So again, we've got a doubling here, right? What is, and I don't think that there's an easy or good answer for this, but it's a question that I think is worth pursuing. What is the relationship between the Theotokos, between Mary as the God-bearer, and that third person of the Trinity, the Holy Spirit as the Comforter? I think that there's an interesting sort of doubling there. Now, obviously, I mean, people have heard of the Hagia Sophia Church. Sophia as a sort of mystical principle is well known in the Christian tradition, though there's often a little bit of slippage between this sort of transcendent mystical figure of Sophia and her human counterparts, whether that be the Marys, or whether that be any of the historical saints that are associated with the name. There's a wonderful statue of Sophia in Sofia, Bulgaria, which actually I think replaced a statue of Lenin. They tore down the statue of Lenin and put up Sophia as a kind of representation of this divine wisdom. But interestingly, Sophia, the city, is named for an historical Saint Sophia. So we start to see all kinds of slippage when we get into the weeds with this. Now, Sophia is, for for us, probably best known as a Gnostic figure. Within the various forms of Gnostic cosmology, she shows up repeatedly as a sort of pivotal figure in the cosmic drama. On the one hand, she appears early on as the syzygy of Christ, that is to say, as the counterpart or bride of Christ. So when we're looking at the emanation of the aeons from the Buthos, from the depth, from the profundity, or the first father, when we see these divine pairs emerge, Christ and Sophia are paired together. But she's also the lowest of the aeons. And if you're familiar with Valentinian cosmology, we know that it is the error of Sophia that ultimately gives rise to the material universe. I like to dramatize this by talking about Sophia as sort of a small child who looks up at what the father and mother, the first principles, are doing, where they are generating things, they are emanating things, and she says, as children are wont to do, I want to do that, right? I want to do that thing. I always imagine Sophia as sort of the child following behind the parent with the bubble mower, right? As the parent mows the front lawn. She's imitating. And so she undertakes a kind of emanation or creation on her own. Now, sometimes this is without the permission of the depth, without the permission of the Buthos and the Sihe, the depth and the silence. Sometimes it is without the participation of her syzygy of Christ. But for whatever reason, this emanation seems to go wrong. And this is not universally the case among Gnostic cosmology, but it's certainly present in the sort of Valentinian notions of Sophianic creation, that she is the ultimate emanator of the son of chaos, of Yaldabaoth, who is the demiurge. Now, she does, whether the sort of error or fall or descent or error is seen as something blameworthy or something voluntary or something that simply befalls her, it does seem to be intimately linked to the emergence of the kenoma, of the material world. And she functions in almost every case as a kind of intermediary between the pleroma and the kenoma, between the fullness, the sort of ogdoatic completeness of the spiritual world, and the kenoma, which is the limited, finite material world. And that, of course, makes sense if we look to the sort of idea of Christ as mediator. That would make sense that the Hagia Sophia, which, as I said, originally pertains to Christ, would have this mediator role. But in the Gnostic cosmology, this seems to take on a new form, where she is a kind of neither nor. She is a liminal figure that sits between the material world and the transcendent original world. At the last, I think it was at the last, or maybe it was the one before, AJC Conclave, I talked about the figure of Diotima. And Diotima in Plato's Symposium talks about love as a kind of intermediary, as a kind of daimon that's got 1 foot in the material world and 1 foot in the transcendent world, and 1 foot in time and 1 foot in eternity. And though I haven't sort of fleshed this out or followed this through, it occurs to me that this is possibly related to this Gnostic conception of, or Neoplatonic conception of Sophia as the mediator. But I think that for us, especially within the Apostolic Johannite Church, what's important here is that she is associated with the spark of the sacred flame. And when I talk about the AJC, and every once in a while, you sort of have to give your what we call the elevator talk, right? You run into somebody and they say, okay, give me the 100 words or less kind of description of the Apostolic Johannite Church. My emphasis is always on the idea of the sacred flame. That seems to me to be absolutely central to who we are as Johannites, as Christians, as Gnostics. And the association of the Sophia with that spark of the sacred flame, I think, is absolutely profound. That she is the residue, she is the vestige of the transcendent world, of the pleroma that resides in the Kenoma. And so if I think about the sort of Valentinian model, and that's just one of many, and I don't want to overemphasize it, but if we think about that Valentinian model, when she emanates this son of chaos, right? This child of chaos, the Yaldabaoth, and he, exerts his influence on the material world. One of the things that he does is creates the first man and woman, or the first man, or the first humans, however you want to interpret that particular passage. And it would seem that this is a purely material thing, but of course, what's important is that he can't help but pass along something of the divine spark that he inherits from his mother when he creates these human beings. And I find that to be a particularly moving kind of story, because as much as we are fallen into a world of finitude and matter, we always carry with us this spark of the sacred flame, this inheritance from our, sort of grandmother, Sophia. So I think that from a Johannite perspective, there is this profound importance of Sophia under the guise of the sacred flame. Now, I do want to just very briefly make a sort of caveat here, because while as a bishop of the AJC, I do have a certain prerogative to speak on behalf of the church, I don't want to be interpreted as speaking dogmatically here. I am very much thinking on my own here, so I don't want to suggest that this is an idea that is an aspect of doctrine or dogma, that one must believe this or something like that, because such doctrines and dogmas are very few and far between in the Apostolic Johannite Church, to such an extent that often people become sort of suspicious. They become a little worried that perhaps something is being hidden from them, because they'll ask a question, well, what's the position on life after death? What's the position on sin? What's the position on suicide or abortion or something like that? And almost inevitably, the answer is, well, we don't have a position on that. We have a range of positions. And the joke has always been that if you put 6 Johannites in a room and ask them a question, you get 7 answers. And I bring that up because at a conclave many years ago, this literally happened. And it happened in the context of talking about the Sophia. We had a workshop about the meaning of Sophia within the Gnostic and Johannite tradition. And sure enough, when we sort of mapped things out and, wrote down some possibilities and tried to sort them out, we literally ended up with more possibilities than there were people in the room. So I don't want to impose, be seen as sort of imposing any kind of dogmatic principle here. But at the same time, it seems to me to be so central to Johannite identity that the sacred flame is present in all people. And ultimately, I think that is one of the few things of which I could say, if you don't believe that, if you don't hold that to be the case, maybe this isn't the place for you, right? That does seem to me to be absolutely essential. And the presence of the sacred flame is named among the 9 principles that are fundamental to Johannite identity. But there's one more aspect in the sort of Gnostic conception of Sophia that I wasn't aware of, actually, until I began to sort of research this introduction. And that is in the Nag Hammadi library, in the text on the origin of the world, which I have to admit I've read, but I'm not familiar with. Sophia is also the one that casts the archons down. She is also the end of the material world. She is also the one that ultimately destroys. And I suddenly began to think of a whole bunch of connections there, right? The doubling, right? Creator, destroyer, but also the beginning and the end, the Alpha and the Omega. And so the conceptions of Sophia, Christ, and Theotokos, and even the incarnate Marys, the principles of the Trinity, of the third person of the Trinity, all of these start to bleed together, but they seem to orbit around this single principle of Sophia. Now, a week ago, we celebrated the descent of Sophia. That is, the coming into the material world of the divine wisdom. And this ultimately is the drama of all souls. That if we associate Sophia with the world soul, with the archetype of the soul writ large, as it were, then her story becomes our story. Her story becomes the sort of drama of our limitation and our desire to return to our homeland. And this is why I think when we look at the Sophianic feasts in the AJC's calendar, we see the association of Sophia with Mary the Theotokos. So there are 2 feasts that are in the canonical, in the Orthodox Catholic calendar, associated with the Blessed Virgin: the birth of Mary, which we just passed, and the Assumption, or in the Orthodox tradition, the Dormition of Mary. So the former becomes the descent of the Holy Sophia, the coming into the world of the Holy Sophia, and Assumption becomes the Assumption of the Holy Sophia, the departure, the end, the withdrawal into wholeness. So I think we start to see this sort of repeated story, a repeated myth of the sort of coming in and the receding back of divine presence through this character of Sophia. Now, there is also one more Marian feast that is celebrated in the AJC calendar that remains as it is. That is not sort of co-opted by the principle of Sophia, and that is the Annunciation, March 25th. That the Annunciation remains a Marian feast. And I think that this is interesting, that there are really these 3 Marian feasts, 2 of which become sort of appropriated into the Sophia, and the other remains identified with the specific historical event of the Annunciation, or quasi-historical event of the Annunciation, to Mary. Now, a lot of this has to do with the sources of the AJC calendar. Much of the AJC calendar in its earliest form, in its initial form, closing in on 30 years ago, was drawn from the calendar of the Ecclesia Gnostica. And I don't think we can talk about the early history of the AJC without acknowledging the profound debt that we owe to Stephan Heller's Ecclesia Gnostica. There was so much work that was done that laid the foundation for so many Gnostic churches, so that we weren't put in a position of reinventing the wheel. So many of the feast days that are still part of the Apostolic Johannite Church calendar come from the Ecclesia Gnostica. And these two Sophianic feasts, the descent of the Holy Sophia and the Assumption of the Holy Sophia, come from that source. So that's why those traditionally Marian feasts get sort of incorporated into the person of Sophia. And I mean, it makes sense just sort of historically that in initially sort of looking at the traditional Christian calendar and saying, okay, how do we wave the magic Gnosticizer over it, which is so often the case in the Gnostic churches, where we just sort of tweak a word here, tweak a concept here, and all of a sudden we transform a traditional Christian figure into a specifically Gnostic figure. I think that there is some sense that that's happened here, that we needed a place to put the Sophia on the calendar, that it would be absurd for a Gnostic church to not have a place for Sophia in the calendar of its feasts. And so again, rather than reinventing the wheel, these Marian feasts were transformed. Much of the Ecclesia Gnostica's calendar ultimately derives from the calendar of the liberal Catholic Church. And I found it very interesting in going back to the calendar of the liberal Catholic Church that the Marian feasts are maintained as Marian feasts. So the descent and the Assumption, or the birth and the Dormition of the Blessed Virgin in the LCC are Marian feasts, because the LCC is not a Gnostic church in the sort of technical sense of the word. I think if one wanted to claim that they were a Gnostic church in the broadest sense of the term, probably many people would be agreeable to that. But what I realize is that there is in the LCC calendar a special date specifically for Sancta Sophia in September 17th, which doesn't seem to line up with any of the Marian feasts that ultimately became, in the EG and later in the AJC, appropriated by the figure of Sophia. So there's a fair bit of slippage between these various calendars. Sophia, for sort of our stream of Gnosticism, becomes very closely associated with the divine feminine, with the presence of the feminine aspect of Godhead, which is so often written out of the canonical and mainstream histories in Christianity, and in other forms of religious expression as well. That the feminine aspect of God is at the very best minimized or marginalized, and at worst simply eliminated and marked over and erased. So the Sophia is an important way in which the divine feminine comes to be present within the context of the Christian and Gnostic tradition. And so I think that looking to this as a sort of important marker in the cycle of time that's mapped out in the AJC calendar is something that is worth pursuing, because this figure is so important in so many ways to the broad drama of Gnostic cosmology. And so she remains an important part of the practice and belief of the Apostolic Johannite Church.